This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nate Sahone, and today is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. It's also the first MTG Top 10 of 2020, so Happy New Year. In this video, I'm doing something subjective, looking at 10 mechanics that I really hope to see more of, maybe even in 2020. In fact, I would certainly have had sagas on this list before we knew that they would be returning in Theros, so maybe a few of these can come back too. I have varying reasons for wanting to see some of these. For some, I think the first time they tried it, it ended up being a dud, but there is a lot of potential. For others, it is simply a mechanic I enjoy playing with. Not all of the mechanics on this list are necessarily mechanics we haven't seen for a while. Several of them are things we've seen kind of recently, but I think we should still be seeing them at a higher frequency than we do. This is, of course, all based on my opinion and nothing more. Alright, let's get started. At number 10, I have Provoke. This is a mechanic we haven't seen since 2003 in Legions, and it was pretty short-lived, only appearing in that single set, and only 9 cards were ever printed with Provoke. I'm uncertain as to why it hasn't been brought back at some point over the years, not even in sets like Time Spiral or Modern Horizons that are jam-packed with mechanics from the game's past. I think this mechanic does something pretty interesting and unique functionally, and it also makes perfect sense flavor-wise. Sure, we have cards, mostly in green, that can force a creature to block if able, but this is more than that, because Provoke can even untap creatures and make them block, making it a more powerful version of that type of effect. Meanwhile, it makes perfect sense that some creatures would have such an ability, especially in red. Red is the color of emotion, impulse, and destructiveness, and provoking a creature taps into all 3 of those things. Mark Rosewater has said this mechanic is a 9 on the Storm scale, meaning we will almost never see it again, but I don't agree with his rationale for that. He says that fight is similar, which is sort of true, I guess, but there's a big difference between fighting something and forcing it to block. There's interesting design space to be explored there. I hope we see Provoke return at some point, as being able to directly attack your opponent's creatures would be an interesting element to add to the game. At number 9, I have Aftermath, a relatively recent mechanic, only introduced in 2017, but I already want to see more of it. Split cards are always interesting because of the varying choices that you are required to make with them, and I think Aftermath split cards are the most interesting. With them, you can only cast the Aftermath half from your graveyard, but that also means that you always get some value out of each side, assuming you have the mana. They're also really interesting design-wise, because the ones we've seen so far each have a half that works fine on its own, but it also has an Aftermath half that synergizes, in most cases, with the part you cast from your hand. Aftermath is just a cool combination of split cards and flashback, and those are both things I really like. I think anything that makes you make more interesting game decisions is something that's good for Magic, and we'll see more things like that as we move up this list. I'm pretty certain we will see Aftermath again, it's only a matter of time, and I hope it's soon. At number 8, I have Manifest, which we last saw in 2015. I know we'll see Morph again, and I'm glad that's the case. It's a good mechanic that makes for interesting gameplay, but I think we need to see Manifest again too. There are a lot of similarities between the two, but there is one big difference. Any card can end up manifested off the top of your library, whether it is a creature or not, and if it is a creature, it doesn't have to have Morph in the first place. This means there is a lot more variance in what can be manifested, and one of the most fun things about Morph is the deception it can allow for, and Manifest gives you another layer for that. Manifest isn't really a mechanic I have to see on a regular basis or anything, but I do want to see it again at some point. At number 7, I have Epic, which debuted in 2005 in Saviors of Kamigawa. Like Provoke, this is a mechanic we have only barely seen. It's only on 5 cards, and the first time we saw it, the execution wasn't awesome, with only Enduring Ideal making any waves. The idea of a spell that is so massive and so powerful that it warps the entire game, but also makes it so you can't ever cast another spell is pretty cool, but the other spells in this cycle don't really live up to that, not even close. So if they ever revisit Epic, we really need to see some big bomby spells that are worth that Epic downside. At number 6, I have Splice, another Kamigawa block mechanic that had potential that it didn't live up to. Like Epic, it was pretty much a complete dud. The idea is cool, being able to take the text from a card in your hand and put it on a card you are casting is pretty neat, especially because you get to hold on to the card you splice onto the card you're casting, meaning you're getting card advantage out of the situation. But Splice has some serious problems. Splice gets a lot of flack for being a parasitic mechanic. This is because the original Splice cards could only be spliced onto Arcane, and Arcane is a spell subtype that only appears in Kamigawa block. A more recent example of a parasitic mechanic would be Energy, since all the payoffs and producers for it are in a single block. But the problems with the mechanic don't end there. The general power level of the cards was also pretty low. Even in Kamigawa block constructed, where you might expect Splice to see a bunch of play because, hey, you're only using Kamigawa block cards, even there, cards with Splice saw barely any play. Even in Limited, with a few exceptions, the cards that you actually ended up splicing onto Arcane were not impressive. So the mechanic is both parasitic and weak in execution, and that is why it is often remembered very negatively. However, in Modern Horizons, they brought the mechanic back on 2 cards, Everdream and Splicer's Skill, with the latter being an extra funny play on words. But the point is, they showed us a way to do Splice that takes away the Arcane requirement, and it worked out pretty well on those 2 cards, at least in terms of Limited. I think this is one we will be seeing again, with these 2 cards, perhaps a preview of what we might see in the future, a less narrow version of Splice. And number 5, it's Hideaway. This is another mechanic that hasn't been utilized a ton. For a long time, their only appearance was on a cycle of lands in Lorwyn. This mechanic lets you tuck a card underneath your card, or hide it away, and then when you meet a certain condition on these lands, you could cast that card for free. It sort of creates a fun sub-game for you to play. For a long time, this wouldn't have really been a mechanic I would have thought much about wanting to see more of, since it seems kind of like a one-trick pony based on the Lorwyn design. But in Modern Horizons, they gave us a new spin on Hideaway, putting it on a creature, and instead of getting to cast the card you hide away for free, you get to put it into your hand. With that design, they showed me that there is way more they could do with Hideaway in the future, and it makes me want to see what more they can do. One kind of awkward thing about Hideaway, though, is that permanents with it have to come into play tapped. And that's a pretty unintuitive thing about the mechanic. It almost feels like it would have been better to just have the lands come into play tapped as part of their normal text and not part of the mechanic, because now they're sort of stuck having to make anything with Hideaway come into play tapped. But either way, I hope to see them do some interesting things with Hideaway in the future. At number 4, I have Fate Seal. It is a mechanic that first received a keyword in Future Sight, where it appeared on only 2 cards, but it actually takes its name from a much older card, Sealed Fate, which has a similar effect. It's basically a scry where instead of making your own card selection better, you make your opponent's worse by manipulating their library. Despite being given a keyword in Future Sight, it also infamously appeared on Jace the Mind Sculptor, though without the actual keyword. His +2 essentially gives you a choice of scrying or fate sealing. I really like the idea of this mechanic overall, and while I think you do have to be a bit careful of making the cards with it too good, because if you do, you're going to be enabling a pretty nasty prison deck, but I think as long as they don't push it too hard, it would be interesting to see in the future. It seems particularly well suited as a Dimir mechanic, but yeah, you don't want to make it possible for people to build a Fate Seal deck or anything, but adding Fate Seal 1 to a few spells here and there would be interesting, kind of like they've done with Scry. At number 3, I have Explore. This is a pretty recent mechanic, introduced in Ixalan in 2017, and it was one I immediately loved. Basically, creatures with Explore can have 3 different effects. The first is, if the top card of your library is a land, you draw it. And that's a nice deal, especially because they put Explore on lots of creatures who had somewhat reasonable stats, so cantripping with them wasn't too bad. If the top card of your library is a non-land, you have one of 2 options, though in both cases, your creature gets a +1/+1 counter. But the other choice is that you can put the card back on top of your library or into your graveyard, giving you a bit of card selection and graveyard manipulation. I really like mechanics like Explore. I like drawing cards, I like card selection, and I think it was really well executed the first time around. It's also a really elegant design that seems simplistic, but really makes for some interesting gameplay. So, unlike some of the mechanics on here, which I think were poorly executed and I think they could do better, that isn't the case here. I just want more of it. And actually, that's true of the top 3 mechanics on this list. I love them all as is and just want them to come back. At number 2, I have Cycling. This is a mechanic that we have seen several times, most recently in Amonkhet block. Cycling is a pretty simple mechanic. It just involves having the ability to pay a cost of some sort for a card and discard it, and you get to draw a card. So, why do I like this mechanic so much? Well, for starters, I think it is really nice and limited, and that's the format I play the most. When it is around in a format, the formats tend to go a lot more smoothly, since if you're having mana screw issues, you can cycle away some expensive spell, and try to find mana. Similarly, if you are getting mana flooded and you have lands with cycling, you can cycle them away and try to find spells. And as I've said, I also like cards that give you options, and cards with cycling are in many ways a split card since you can do two different things with it, either cast it or cycle it. Things get more interesting when there are cycling synergies around, as is often the case when we see cycling. So we see this mechanic a lot, but honestly, I would be pretty happy if cycling was evergreen, appearing on a few unimpressive commons in most sets, so that your 6 mana 5/6 you really wish you weren't playing could also give you a cycling option if you're struggling to get to that 6 mana, maybe a colorless land in every set that can be cycled away. Those are the kind of things I'm looking for. It is a simple mechanic, but one that I like a lot and might even be good for the health of the game, at least in Limited. And at number 1, I have Investigate, another mechanic that draws you cards. It made its debut in Shadows over Innistrad, a set all about uncovering the mystery of what was causing a bunch of weird stuff on the plane, so it was definitely a flavor win for the set. Cards with Investigate make clue tokens, which are artifacts you can pay 2 mana to sacrifice to draw a card. I think this is a much more interesting way to have creatures or other spells be cantrips, since you have to decide at what point later in the game you can use that 2 mana to cash it in for the card. The fact that they are both tokens and artifacts also opens up all sorts of different possible interactions. Blue-green Investigate in Shadows over Innistrad is one of my favorite draft archetypes of all time, and I'm really looking forward to the day when we might see it again. I'm looking forward to cashing in those clues to get that awesome card advantage. So, those are my picks for the mechanics I want to see more of, and I'm hoping we see more of them in 2020. In the comments, let me know what mechanics you want to come back. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see all of the MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.